Flavius Sabinus is dead because a herald made a mistake, and everyone in the room understands that the mistake is not the point. It's 83 or 84 AD, inside the palace on the Palatine Hill, and the emperor's cousin, a man of impeccable family, married to Domitian's own niece, has just been executed on the emperor's order. Suetonius records the official reason. A herald, announcing candidates for the consulship, introduced Sabinus not as consul, but, by slip of the tongue, as emperor. One wrong word, spoken by someone else, about a man who never claimed the title. That was enough. Sabinus had done nothing. He'd said nothing. He was killed for a title he never sought, spoken by a mouth that wasn't his, because the man on the throne had reached a state of mind in which nearness to power was itself the crime. If loyalty, family, and silence couldn't save Domitian's own cousin from a herald's slip of the tongue, the question worth sitting with is simple. What in this court could have saved you? Domitian became emperor in 81 AD, the younger son of Vespasian and the last of the Flavian dynasty, inheriting a throne his father and brother Titus had spent a decade stabilizing after the chaos of Nero's fall and the civil war of 69 AD. He was not, by most accounts, incompetent. Suetonius and modern archaeology agree. He was a capable administrator. He reformed the currency, expanded the Colosseum's amenities, pursued an active building program, and ran a competent, if aggressive, frontier policy along the Rhine and Danube. This is worth stating plainly, because the reputation this video is built around is not one of a bumbling tyrant. It's the reputation of a highly functional autocrat who became, over roughly a 15-year reign, one of the most lethal men to be near in Roman history. The court around him in the 80s and 90s AD was the Roman Senate's old aristocracy, men who had survived Nero, survived the Year of the Four Emperors, and now served an emperor from a comparatively new imperial family with something to prove. Domitian, unlike his father and brother, insisted on formal deference. Contemporary sources describe him requiring the address Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title neither Vespasian nor Titus had claimed. He controlled the Senate's business closely, staffed the empire's key administrative posts with equestrians and freedmen loyal directly to him rather than senators with independent standing, and, according to Tacitus, who served as a senator through this exact period and says so explicitly in the opening of his biography of Agricola, governed through an atmosphere in which the Senate itself became a hunting ground. This story was worth suppressing for a straightforward reason. The men who survived Domitian's court to write its history were the same men who had sat silently through the purges, and their own conduct under his reign was not, by their own later standards, especially heroic. The turning point, by nearly every ancient account, was 89 AD, the revolt of Lucius Antonius Saturninus, governor of Upper Germany, who rose against Domitian with 2 legions and was crushed within weeks when the Rhine, unusually, failed to freeze and stranded the German allies Saturninus had been counting on. Suetonius treats this as the hinge on which Domitian's character turned decisively toward paranoia, and while modern historians are more cautious about such a clean psychological pivot, the pattern in the sources afterward is unmistakable. The trials for treason, maiestas, the Roman charge for offenses against the dignity of the state, effectively meaning offenses against the emperor personally, multiply sharply in the record from this point forward. The mechanism mattered as much as the motive. Roman law required accusers, not state prosecutors, and Domitian's court cultivated a professional class of informers, the delatores, who brought treason charges against wealthy senators in exchange for a share of the condemned man's confiscated estate. Pliny the Younger, writing after Domitian's death, describes the delatores as a plague that infested the Senate itself, men who had once been colleagues turning informer against colleagues for profit and self-preservation. This is a crucial detail for understanding why the reign was so psychologically corrosive. The danger wasn't only the emperor's suspicion, it was that your fellow senator, invited to your dinner table, had every financial incentive to report what you said there. Flavius Sabinus's execution over the herald's slip belongs to this climate, though Suetonius places it earlier, closer to the start of the reign, suggesting the paranoia had roots before Saturninus's revolt and simply accelerated afterward. Around the same period, Domitian moved against members of his own extended family and household. His niece's husband, Titus Flavius Clemens, a man Suetonius describes as being of notable idleness and lack of ambition, precisely the profile that should have made him safe, was executed on what Suetonius calls the flimsiest of charges, generally understood to relate to atheism, a charge ancient and modern historians alike connect to either Judaism or early Christianity, practiced within the imperial family itself. Clemen's own children had been designated as Domitian's heirs. Being next in line, under this emperor, was not protection, it was exposure. The philosophers fared no better, and their story is one of the better documented casualties, because the men who wrote about it survived to do so. Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome entirely on at least 2 occasions, according to Suetonius and the later historian Cassius Dio, and executed several associated with senatorial resistance, including Arulinus Rusticus, condemned largely for authoring a laudatory biography of Thrasea Paetus, a senator executed decades earlier under Nero for the crime of quiet, principled non-participation in tyranny. The books themselves were burned publicly in the Forum, on Domitian's order. According to Tacitus's account in the Agricola, a detail Tacitus includes with evident bitterness, noting that the senators who ordered the burning apparently believed fire could reach the conscience of mankind, along with the words on the page, and were wrong, since copies survived, and the men who burned them were forgotten faster than the men they'd tried to erase. Tacitus's own testimony about this period is unusually personal for an ancient historian, and it's worth pausing on why. He was a sitting senator through the worst of it, and in the opening of the Agricola, written shortly after Domitian's death, he describes the Senate of this era in language close to confession, watching colleagues marched out to execution, watching others inform on them for gain, and surviving himself by exactly the kind of silence he elsewhere despises in his subjects. This is the closest a major Roman historian comes to admitting complicity in the system he's condemning, and it colors everything else he writes about the period, not as a reason to distrust his account, but as a reason to notice that his account was written, in part, to explain his own survival. By the account preserved in Suetonius, Domitian's final years were marked by a documented habit of interrogating condemned men under torture to extract further names, expanding each purge outward into new purges, and by a personal terror that Suetonius describes in detail, a polished stone gallery in the palace, reflective enough that Domitian could see behind him as he walked it, because he no longer trusted open rooms. Whether this detail is literal fact or a vivid rhetorical flourish meant to crystallize the man's state of mind, ancient historians disagree, and this channel won't pretend certainty it doesn't have. What isn't disputed is the outcome such fear produced. A conspiracy within his own household, involving his wife Domitia Longina, according to Suetonius, his chamberlain, and members of the Praetorian Guard, ended his reign with a knife in 96 AD, killed in the end, not by a senator he'd purged, but by the people closest enough to him to know exactly how he could be reached. The Senate's response to Domitian's death was immediate and telling. A formal damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of memory, voted through within hours, according to Suetonius. Domitian's name was chiseled from inscriptions across the empire. His statues were pulled down and, per Suetonius's account, melted for their bronze. Arches and monuments bearing his image were reworked or demolished. This was not private grief being processed quietly. It was the Senate's public performance of having always opposed a tyrant that most of its members had, in fact, served without visible resistance for 15 years. The historical record that survives reflects exactly who benefited from that performance. Suetonius wrote his biography of Domitian a generation later, under an emperor, Hadrian, whose dynasty owed nothing to Flavian legitimacy. Tacitus wrote as a senator who had personally survived the purges by silence and needed the historical verdict on Domitian to be damning enough to retroactively justify that silence as prudence rather than complicity. Pliny the Younger, whose Panegyricus survives as a lavish celebration of Domitian's successor Trajan, spends long passages contrasting Trajan's virtue against Domitian's tyranny, useful political theater for a man who had himself held office and prospered under the emperor he now condemned. What was destroyed was Domitian's own version of events, along with any administrative record that might have complicated the uniform monstrousness the sources agree to present. What survived was written entirely by men whose personal rehabilitation depended on Domitian's memory being as black as possible, which doesn't make their accounts false, but does mean every one of them had a reason to make sure it was believed. The purges were real, the delatores were real, and the Senate's fear was real enough that its most honest chronicler admits, in his own words, to surviving by silence rather than courage. What's harder to verify is the precise psychological portrait, the reflective gallery, the escalating paranoia as character study, since every source describing Domitian's inner life wrote after his death, for audiences and patrons who needed him condemned. What the evidence supports without much argument is this. Domitian built a system in which proximity to power was indistinguishable from danger, where the people best positioned to destroy you were the ones sharing your table. and where the safest political position turned out to be silence, right up until silence stopped being safe too. That's not a uniquely Roman arrangement. It's what any court, boardroom, or institution looks like. Once loyalty stops being a virtue and starts being a liability nobody can prove they don't have.